Now, Gustavo Ribeiro joins us. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. Gustavo, great to have you back on the show. Now, today marks the end of the Jair Bolsonaro era. How would you describe the last 4 years of his presidency and what this transition means?
Thanks for having me and Happy New Year. I think we can say that the Bolsonaro presidency was a convoluted moment in Brazilian history, and we saw over these past 4 years the dismantlement of the state apparatus in several areas, more notably education, the environment, and healthcare. We saw a government that actively sought to delay vaccine purchase when the COVID pandemic broke, and that went against scientific consensus almost at every turn. Lula has just finished his first address before a joint session of Congress just minutes ago, and he tried to mark a difference between himself and his predecessor at every time, saying that he will, in his words, conduct the rebuilding of the Brazilian state.
Now, veteran left-wing politician is Lula da Silva. He led the country between 2003 and 2010. How has the country changed since 20 years ago, and what will Lula need to do differently to lead the country in the next 4 years, do you think?
Well, we will find a lot of similar problems, although the country has drastically changed over these past 2 decades. But we still are battling again against the hunger crisis. Brazilian households are heavily indebted, and we have had a sluggish economy over the past decade. So he will have to foster economic growth, although his party and himself, they believe in using the state as an inductor of growth. The Brazilian government is cash-strapped right now, so he will have a tough time conducting these policies. Another big difference between 2002 and now is that we didn't have social media back then. And now he will face a heavily divided country with a strong far right, especially in the social media terrain, with conspiracy mongering and a sizable part of the electorate who do not see Lula as a legitimate leader. So he will have to deliver economic results very fast. Otherwise, pressure from the far right could mount, and he could see approval ratings dip very quickly, which we have seen in other countries, especially in Latin America.
Let's talk more about that. Bolsonaro made a big deal of leaving the country, and this all seems to be part of his Trump-style political agenda. Does this suggest he's going to continue his efforts to claim the election was stolen? How much is this reverberating across the country? You mentioned social media there, conspiracy theories. Is there a wave of denialism among his supporters now, much like there is perhaps, among the Trump supporters in some parts of the country here in the US?
Yes, and that belief that the election was stolen from Bolsonaro remains as strong as ever. The former president, has not considered the election 2 months later still. And for instance, I'm in Brasilia. The Esplanade of Ministries is where Lula is taking office. Just 7 kilometers from there, we still have a campsite of Bolsonaro supporters who call for a coup d'etat and still believe that the armed forces could intervene and prevent the peaceful transition of power, which, is an already lost battle because Lula, as of now, is already the new president of Brazil.
And Lula did serve time in prison on corruption charges, though, and that was only a few years ago. The Supreme Court overruled the sentence, and he was released just a few years ago. So how significant is this, that the country's new president is also an ex-prisoner? Is there a level of controversy, given that there was so at the time that the Supreme Court made that decision? Is it a point of contention in the public?
Well, Lula's corruption verdicts are like a Rorschach test. So if you ask people on the left, they will say that Lula was the victim of a witch hunt, that the judge that the trial judge that convicted him the first time and went to become Jair Bolsonaro's justice minister, and is now a senator-elect, so he had political motivations. And they also say that leaks that came after Lula was already in prison, show that the judge was actively quarterbacking the prosecution, which he is not mandated to do, to get more convictions. So they say Lula was a political prisoner. If you ask a Lula detractor, they will say that it's a sham that the Supreme Court has quashed these verdicts and that Lula is a crook and should not be in the presidency. And the polls showed in October the 30th that this divide is almost a 50-50 split because Lula won with 50.9% of the votes, just a razor-thin margin.
Interesting. All right, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thanks very much for that. Gustavo Ribeiro there, founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report.